leaned in close at the reception, close enough that I could smell the cologne my daughter had probably bought him for Christmas, and he said very quietly, "You have until Sunday to clear your things out. This house belongs to me now." My daughter had been in the ground for 6 hours. I looked at him. He was already looking past me, toward the buffet table, toward the neighbors who'd come to pay their respects, already playing the grieving widower for anyone watching. 53 years old, salt and pepper hair, the kind of firm handshake that makes people trust you at first meeting. I had trusted him once. My daughter loved him, so I loved him. That's how it works when you're a father. I nodded. I didn't argue. I set down my cup of coffee and I walked out to the back porch of the house I had built with my own 2 hands in 1987, and I stood there in the November cold looking out at the birch trees along the property line until my son-in-law went back inside. Let me back up. My name is Raymond Holt. I'm 67 years old. I lived on 43 acres outside of Peterborough, Ontario. My wife Doris passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, my daughter Joanna moved back to the property. She'd been living in Toronto with her husband, but she wanted to be close to me, she said, wanted to make sure I was eating. She was that kind of woman. She thought about other people before herself, always had. Her husband came with her naturally. His name was Trevor Ashford. He was in commercial real estate, which I mention not as a character judgment but because it matters later. He knew the value of things. He knew how to look at a piece of land and see what it could become, what it could sell for. I see that clearly now. At the time, I thought he was just a man who talked too much at dinner. The 43 acres had been in my family since my father bought it in 1962. My father had worked in the mill in Lindsay for 22 years to afford it. He was from Cape Breton originally, one of 7 kids, and he always said the only thing worth having was land that nobody could take from you. He cleared 3 acres himself the first summer. My mother planted a garden that is still there, or was until recently. I grew up on that property. I raised Joanna there after we moved back from Calgary in 1994. I built the main house and the workshop and the small guest cabin by the pond over the course of 15 years on weekends and holidays, a little at a time. It was not worth a great deal of money when I built it. It is worth considerably more now. The region had grown. There were people from Toronto buying up land in that corridor, building weekend retreats, and the value had gone up in ways that still surprised me when I bothered to check. I didn't think about it much. It wasn't an investment to me. It was home. Trevor thought about it, though. I could see that now. Joanna got sick in the spring. Not suddenly. There had been small things. Tiredness that didn't lift. Headaches. A strange bruise on her forearm that the doctor initially dismissed. Then a blood test. Then another. Then a specialist in Toronto. A very quiet man who spoke carefully and looked at his desk while he delivered the news. Acute myeloid leukemia. She was 41 years old. I will not spend much time on those months because I don't think I can do it without breaking apart, and that's not what this is. What I will say is that Joanna fought. She went through 2 rounds of chemotherapy at Princess Margaret in Toronto. She lost her hair, and then it grew back, and then she lost it again. Trevor was there, or he seemed to be. He drove her to appointments. He held her hand in the photographs. But there was something, I couldn't name it then. A quality of distraction. His phone was always in his hand. He stepped outside to take calls more than seemed necessary. I told myself he was managing his work, keeping things running so they'd have income. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because Joanna trusted him. She died on the 1st of November. The service was at St. Mary, John's in Peterborough, where her mother and I had been married. There were more people than I expected. She had touched a lot of lives. There were nurses who had cared for her who came on their days off. There were friends from university, women who had driven from as far as Sudbury. I stood at the front of the church, and I could not speak for the first 30 seconds. I had prepared something. I could not say it. I said something else, I don't know what, and I sat down. At the reception at my house with the casseroles on the kitchen counter and the neighbors in the living room and the gray November light coming through the windows, that's when Trevor found me. He didn't make a scene. He was too careful for that. He simply appeared at my elbow and said what he said. "Until Sunday, clear your things." And then he moved away, and a moment later I heard him thanking someone for coming, his voice warm and a little broken with grief. Sunday was 5 days away. I went out to the porch. I stood in the cold. I thought very carefully. The house was in Joanna's name. She and I had arranged it that way when Doris died. A simple transfer done with a local lawyer, partly for estate purposes, partly because I had thought, foolishly, I can see now, that it would protect the property from probate complications if something happened to me. Joanna had been young and healthy, and the transfer had seemed like sensible planning. She had not updated her will after her diagnosis, or rather, she had tried to, and she had not been well enough. And then there had been no more time, which meant that when she died, the property passed to her husband. I had spoken to a lawyer already. I had called him the week before Joanna died, when she was no longer conscious, and I was sitting in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, and I had begun to understand what was coming. His name is Douglas Fairfax, and he has an office on Aylmer Street, and he has known my family for 20 years. I had explained the situation. He had listened carefully. Then he had asked me a question. "Raymond," he said, "did Joanna ever set up a separate trust for the land? Anything separate from the house title? Any documentation about the intention behind the transfer?" I told him I didn't think so. But I told him I would look. I had 2 weeks before she died, and during those 2 weeks when I wasn't at the hospital, I went through every file in my workshop. I found 30 years of tax returns, insurance papers, the original deed to the property from 1962 when my father bought it, letters from my mother, a photograph of Joanna at age 4 sitting on the tractor my father had left behind. I also found a letter. Joanna had written it to me 3 years earlier, before she got sick. It was handwritten, in the purple pen she always used, dated a Sunday in March. She had given me some investments her grandmother had left her. A small amount, about $40,000. And she had written to explain what she wanted me to do with the money. And in the letter she had written, "Dad, I know this land is yours. It will always be yours. Whatever happens, that's how I think of it. Whatever's on paper, the land is yours." It was not a legal document, but it was something. Douglas had looked at the letter. He had also looked at something else I had found in the same box. An old document, typewritten from 1989, when my father's estate was settled. A clause I had not read closely in 30 years. The property had been transferred to me from my father's estate with a notation not legally binding in the way a formal trust would be, but present, that the land was intended to remain in the family and was not to be sold outside the family without the consent of surviving Holt family members. "It's not airtight," Douglas had said, "but it's something to work with. And combined with what Trevor appears to have been doing, we may have more than you think." What Trevor had been doing. That came out in stages. Douglas had a contact, a woman he referred to as a due diligence specialist, which I understood to mean a private investigator with better stationery. Her name was Bernadette. She was compact and quiet and wore reading glasses on a chain, and she spoke in the flat, efficient way of someone who deals in facts for a living. What she found was this. Trevor had, in the months before Joanna died, contacted 2 separate land developers operating in the Peterborough and Kawartha Lakes region. He had inquired about their interest in a 43-acre property currently in a transitional ownership situation. He had received written responses expressing strong interest. He had attended one preliminary meeting in person in Toronto in September, while Joanna was in her second round of chemotherapy and I was with her. He had also, and this is what made Douglas go very quiet for a moment, he had also been in a relationship with someone else, a woman who worked in the administrative office of the clinic where Joanna receives treatment. The relationship had been ongoing for at least 14 months. Bernadette had documentation. I am not going to describe how she obtained it because I don't think it's relevant and because some things, once you know them, you can't unknow, and I am still managing what I know. I packed a bag on the Friday. I called my nephew in Peterborough, my sister's son Lloyd, and I stayed in his spare room. Trevor watched me go from the front step. He didn't say anything. He looked, I thought, relieved. He stopped looking relieved on Tuesday. Douglas filed a caveat on the property that Monday, which in Ontario means a formal notice to the land registry that there is a pending claim against the title. Trevor could not sell, transfer, or mortgage the property while that caveat was in place. He also filed a notice of application in Superior Court on the basis of the 1989 Family Clause and the unjust enrichment doctrine, the argument being that the property had been improved and maintained almost entirely through my labor and my father's labor, that the transfer to Joanna had been made with the explicit understanding that it remained the family homestead, and that allowing Trevor to benefit from that would be unjust. That was the legal argument. There was also a separate matter. Bernadette's documentation went to the Ontario Provincial Police on the Wednesday, not from Douglas. That went through a different channel, a contact of Douglas's who had connections in the right direction. I won't pretend to understand all of it. What I understand is that there were questions about Joanna's final months of treatment that had not been asked before they needed to be asked now. Questions about access to medication, about the rate of decline in her final 6 weeks, which had been faster than the oncologist had anticipated, about the woman in the administrative office, and what access she may have had to what kinds of records. I am not saying I know what happened. I am saying that there were questions, and that the police agreed they were questions worth asking. Trevor was brought in for a formal interview on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Joanna's funeral. I was at Lloyd's kitchen table when Douglas called to tell me. Lloyd was making coffee. He looked at me when I set down my phone, and I suppose my face told him something because he put a cup in front of me without saying anything, which is exactly what I needed. The caveat hearing was set for February, but Trevor's solicitor contacted Douglas in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and proposed a settlement discussion. Douglas told me about it on the phone. He wants to negotiate, Douglas said. That generally means he's been told by someone, the OPP or his own lawyer or both, that his position is considerably weaker than he thought. We met in a boardroom in Peterborough in January. Trevor came with his lawyer, a man in a very good suit who spoke quickly and professionally and avoided looking at me directly. I came with Douglas. I wore my father's watch, the one he'd worn every day at the mill. I don't know why. It seemed like the right thing to have on. Trevor looked smaller than I remembered. The collar on his shirt was too loose, like he had lost weight. He sat across the table, and he did not look at me once during the 3 hours we sat there. The agreement we reached was this. The property was to be transferred back to me in full in exchange for my withdrawal from certain aspects of the civil litigation. The agreement was silent on other matters. The OPP matter was not part of the settlement and could not be, which Douglas had made clear from the beginning. The transfer was registered with the Provincial Land Registry by the end of January. I signed the papers and I walked out of that boardroom and I drove back out to the property by myself. It was a clear day in January, cold, the birch trees bare, the pond frozen. I parked in the laneway and I sat in the truck for a while. I thought about my father clearing those first 3 acres by himself in the summer of 1962. I thought about my mother's garden. I thought about Joanna at 4 years old on that tractor, squinting into the sun. There was a stand of old white pines along the north edge of the property, trees that were already mature when my father bought the land. Trees that were probably there when this was all bush, and no one had yet decided to call it anything. I had always meant to do something to protect them formally. Joanna had talked about it once. She had read about conservation easements, legal agreements with land trusts that limit what future owners can do with a piece of land. She had printed something off the internet about it and left it on the kitchen table for me one morning, with a sticky note that said, "Dad, for when you're ready." In February, I met with the Kawartha Land Trust. Douglas came with me. We drew up a conservation easement covering the north 30 acres of the property, including the pine stand, the pond, and the creek that runs along the east side. The easement will run with the land permanently. No future owner, not me, not whoever comes after me, not anyone can develop those 30 acres. They stay as they are. I named the easement for Joanna. The woman from the clinic, the one Bernadette had documented, was interviewed by the OPP in March. I do not know the full details of what came of that because Douglas has advised me to be careful about what I say publicly, and I am trying to follow his advice. What I can say is that the investigation is ongoing. That is the phrase Douglas uses. Ongoing. Trevor is no longer in Peterborough. I have heard, through Lloyd, that he is in Calgary. I don't think much about where he is. What I think about is this. I walk the property now most mornings when the weather allows. I go out early before it's fully light, and I walk the path along the creek that my father cut through the bush in 1965. The creek is loud in spring when the snow is melting off the Canadian Shield to the north, and the water is running fast and brown with tannin. In winter it goes quiet under the ice. I have walked that path my entire life, and I still find things on it I haven't noticed before. A particular bend, a rock, the way the light comes through the pines in late afternoon in November when the sun is low and the shadows run long across the frozen ground. Joanna walked that path too. She walked it as a little girl. She walked it with me the October before she died, the last time she was well enough on a Sunday morning. Slowly, stopping often, the leaves coming down all around us. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She had always understood, the way some people just do, what a place like this means and why it matters and what it costs to lose it. She asked me on that walk if I was going to be all right. I told her I would figure it out. I am figuring it out.